If you were to completely detach from your physical body, how would you know you still existed? Philosophers have spent centuries attempting to construct an answer from the top down, arguing that our thoughts, our doubts, and our sharpest intellectual calculations are the true anchors of selfhood. We are told that we think, and therefore we are. But this intellectual hubris overlooks a silent, inescapable, physiological reality. In the sterile chambers of sensory deprivation, where light is extinguished, sound is canceled, and the skin no longer feels the pressure of the external world, the mind does not float away into a state of pure, disembodied reason. Instead, the universe shrinks to a single, localized, rhythmic thump, a heavy, echoing cadence that reverberates through the hollows of the skull. In the absence of the world, you are left with nothing but the heartbeat. And then a strange psychological shift occurs. In that absolute quiet, if you listen too closely, if you focus entirely on that rhythm, the boundary between the self and the not-self begins to fray. The very mechanism that should ground you starts to feel alien, like an external engine, driving a machine you merely inhabit. We assume our heartbeat is a simple, mechanical pump, a background utility of survival. Yet, modern neuroscience is beginning to uncover a far more profound, almost haunting truth. Your heartbeat does not merely sustain your brain. It actively constructs your perception of reality. It dictates what you see, how you feel, and where you believe your consciousness resides in space. We are tethered to this physical existence, not by our loftiest thoughts, but by a cyclical shockwave of blood. This is the heartbeat paradox. The very rhythm that anchors your consciousness to your body is also the boundary line that, if crossed, threatens to dissolve your sense of self entirely. What if your mind is not the master of your body, but an elaborate projection generated by the rhythmic pulsing of your chest? To understand this relationship, we must first dismantle the traditional image of the human brain as an isolated, sovereign monarch. For decades, both science and philosophy treated the brain as a highly sophisticated computer, sitting safely inside the dark vault of the skull, receiving data from the outside world, processing it, and commanding the body to react. In this view, the heart was merely the power supply, a dumb, muscular pump whose only job was to keep the oxygen flowing to the delicate, thinking gray matter above. But this top-down model of consciousness is radically incomplete. Every time your heart beats, it sends a massive physical pressure wave propagating through your arterial system. This wave travels up the carotid arteries, physically shaking the brain tissue. This is not a subtle event. It is a biological earthquake that occurs roughly 80,000 times a day. If your brain did not actively work to filter this movement out, your entire visual field would bounce up and down with every beat of your heart. Your world would be an unstable, vibrating blur. To prevent this, your brain has developed an extraordinary system of sensory gating. It anticipates the heartbeat, calculates the physical disruption, and subtracts it from your conscious awareness. In essence, your brain is constantly editing your perception of the universe. To hide the physical reality of your own heart, this editing process is so profound that it alters how you interact with the world on a millisecond by millisecond basis. If a flash of light, a sudden sound, or a human face is presented to you at the exact millisecond, your heart contracts. A phase known as systole. Your brain is statistically less likely to perceive it. It is as if the brain, momentarily preoccupied with absorbing the physical impact of the heart's pulse, briefly closes its gates to the outside world. We are, quite literally, blind to certain slices of reality during the peak of our cardiac cycle. Conversely, when the heart relaxes during diastole, the gates open, and our sensitivity to the environment sharpens. Our connection to reality is not a continuous, unbroken stream. It is a flickering, pulsing transmission. We experience the world in fragments, timed to the biological metronome swinging in our chests. This constant dialogue between the brain and the heart is carried along a neural superhighway known as the vagus nerve, supplemented by a complex network of baroreceptors, specialized pressure sensors located in the walls of your major arteries. These receptors act like microscopic seismographs, registering the exact force and timing of each cardiac contraction. They do not just report this data to the survival centers of the brain stem. They feed it directly into the cortical networks responsible for emotional processing, decision-making, and self-awareness. When these baroreceptors fire during a heartbeat, they suppress the activity of the amygdala, the brain's emotional alarm system. The brain interprets the strong, steady physical compression of the artery walls as a signal of safety, momentarily dampening its response to external threats. If you are shown an image of a fearful face during the quiet interval between heartbeats, you will perceive it as mildly startling. Show that same face at the exact moment of your heartbeat, and your brain's threat detection systems are subtly muted. This reveals an astonishing vulnerability in our intellectual independence. Your judgments, your fears, and your empathy are not purely rational computations. They are constantly being biased, reshaped, and modulated by the pressure of your blood. The intellect does not sit in detached judgment above the body. It is suspended within the rhythmic tides of the cardiovascular system. But this biological coupling runs even deeper than the modulation of our senses. It touches the very core of what we call the ego. In the deep recesses of the parietal and insular cortices lies the neural machinery responsible for generating your egocentric frame of reference. The subjective feeling that you are a localized entity, sitting behind your eyes, looking out at a world that is separate from you. This sense of being a cohesive I is so natural that we rarely think to question it. We take for granted that our consciousness has a home, a specific coordinate in space. Yet, when neuroscientists map the brain activity associated with this sense of bodily selfhood, they find something extraordinary. The brain regions that construct your sense of physical presence do not rely on vision, hearing, or even the signals from your muscles to determine where you are. Instead, they rely on a neural signal known as the heartbeat evoked potential, or HEP. The HEP is a distinct electrical signature generated by the brain in response to each heartbeat. It is a continuous internal echo of the heart's rhythm, bouncing through the neural pathways of the cortex. When researchers artificially manipulate or disrupt this signal, the results are deeply unsettling. Patients report feeling disconnected from their physical forms, as if their consciousness is floating slightly above or behind their actual bodies. In clinical conditions like depersonalization disorder, where individuals feel like ghost-like observers of their own lives, the brain's electrical response to the heartbeat is markedly diminished. Without this constant internal echo, the illusion of being anchored to the flesh begins to dissolve. The mind loses its compass. It can no longer locate itself in space because it has lost the biological anchor that defines the center of its universe. This leaves us with a profound, unresolved paradox. We think of our consciousness as a grand, ethereal space, an intellectual theater capable of contemplating the cosmos, understanding quantum mechanics, and dreaming of eternity. Yet, this entire vast architecture of thought appears to be fundamentally dependent on a raw, primitive, repetitive somatic cycle. The mind is a kite flying high in the winds of abstraction, but the string that keeps it from drifting away into nothingness is tied directly to a bloody muscle beating in the dark. If our very sense of self, our emotional stability, and our moment-to-moment perception of reality are entirely constructed by this biological metronome, then who is actually in control? Are we truly autonomous minds experiencing a body, or are we merely the narrative that a pulsing cardiovascular system tells itself to make sense of its own survival? To grasp the full weight of this dependency, we must venture into the hidden landscape of interoception, the nervous system's quiet, continuous mapping of the body's internal state. While our outward-facing senses of sight, sound, and touch allow us to navigate the external environment, it is this interior sense that tells us what it feels like to exist. It is the raw canvas upon which the mind paints the picture of the self, and at the absolute center of this canvas sits the insular cortex, a deeply buried fold of the brain that acts as the primary translator of the body's inner storm. The insula does not merely receive raw data from the heart. It translates those physical pulsations into the very texture of our emotional lives. When you experience a sudden surge of fear, anger, or joy, you do not feel it as an abstract thought. You feel it as a tightness in your chest, a sudden acceleration of your pulse, a shift in the pressure behind your ribs. For over a century, psychologists debated whether the emotion or the bodily reaction came first. We assumed we saw a threat, felt fear, and then our heart raced. But pioneering neurosomatic research has inverted this assumption. The physical change in the heart's rhythm often precedes the conscious awareness of the emotion. The brain reads the sudden acceleration of the heartbeat via the insula, and, in a desperate bid to make sense of this internal shift, searches the external environment for a justification. If there is a threat nearby, the brain labels the feeling as fear. If there is an attractive stranger, it labels it as excitement. If there is nothing obvious, it labels it as general, free-floating anxiety. This means that our conscious emotional states are essentially interpretive stories. They are narratives constructed after the fact by a brain trying to rationalize the erratic behavior of its cardiac engine. We are not rational beings who happen to have hearts. We are emotional creatures whose intellect is constantly scrambling to justify the somatic whims of our cardiovascular systems. The heart writes the music, and the mind merely translates it into lyrics. This biological hierarchy becomes beautifully apparent when we examine how the heart synchronizes not just with our own minds, but with the minds of others. When two human beings sit opposite one another in deep conversation, sharing a moment of intense empathy or mutual understanding, something extraordinary happens. Their heart rates begin to synchronize. Their cardiovascular rhythms align, matching beat for beat in a silent, invisible dance. This phenomenon of cardiac coupling is not restricted to romantic partners or lifelong friends. It occurs between strangers engaged in a shared task, between an audience and a speaker, and between a therapist and a patient. This synchronization is the somatic foundation of empathy. Before we understand someone intellectually, we understand them cardiovascularly. Our nervous systems read the micro-expressions and subtle postural shifts of the other person, translating them into internal cardiac adjustments that mirror their physiological state. We literally feel what they feel because our hearts have entered the same rhythm. But this shared rhythm also reveals a deeper, more unsettling truth about the boundaries of our individuality. If your heartbeat can be influenced, modulated, and synchronized by the presence of another human being, then your very sense of self is not an island. It is a porous, dynamic system that is constantly being co-authored by the bodies around you. The invisible threads of our cardiac cycles weave us into a shared somatic fabric. Yet, this constant alignment comes at a cost. When the heart's rhythm becomes too rigid, too predictable, or too easily influenced, the mind begins to fracture. In healthy individuals, the heart does not beat with the mechanical precision of a clock. If your average heart rate is 60 beats per minute, it does not beat exactly once every second. Instead, the time interval between consecutive beats is constantly shifting, a phenomenon known as heart rate variability, or HRV. A high HRV indicates a highly adaptive nervous system, one that is capable of rapidly shifting between the fight or flight sympathetic state and the rest and digest parasympathetic state. It is a sign of physiological and psychological resilience. When HRV drops, when the heart begins to beat with a cold, monotonous, clock-like regularity, the mind loses its flexibility. Low HRV is a hallmark of severe clinical depression, post-traumatic stress disorder, and chronic anxiety. In these states, the heart becomes locked in a rigid, defensive pattern, refusing to adapt to the subtle shifts of the environment. The brain, receiving this monotonous, unyielding signal of distress from the baroreceptors, interprets it as an ongoing existential emergency. It shuts down the higher order networks responsible for creative thinking, empathy, and open-mindedness, locking the individual into a state of cognitive hypervigilance and emotional paralysis. The person is trapped in a mental prison, not because their thoughts are broken, but because their biological metronome has lost its capacity to swing. This raises a profound question about the nature of mental illness and psychological healing. If the rigidity of our thoughts is merely a reflection of the rigidity of our cardiac rhythm, then perhaps we cannot think our way out of our deepest suffering. Perhaps the mind can only find freedom when the heart is allowed to regain its natural, erratic dance. If the brain is completely dependent on this variable, organic rhythm to maintain its connection to reality and its sense of sanity, what happens when we replace the natural heart with an artificial one? What happens to human consciousness when the organic pulse is extinguished and replaced by a machine that does not beat? To explore the ultimate boundary of this paradox, we must look to an extraordinary and unsettling frontier in modern medicine: the invention of the continuous flow left ventricular assist device, or LVAD. These mechanical pumps are surgically implanted into patients experiencing terminal heart failure. Unlike early artificial hearts, which attempted to mimic the natural, pulsing rhythm of human biology, these modern machines utilize a tiny, spinning turbine that pushes blood through the vascular system in a constant, uninterrupted stream. The device saves the patient's life, but it does so by stripping them of their pulse. When you touch the wrist of an LVAD patient, you feel absolute stillness. There is no rhythmic thud beneath the skin, no rising and falling tension in the arteries. If you listen to their chest, you do not hear the familiar, reassuring cadence of life. You hear the flat, mechanical hum of an electric motor. They are alive, functional, and fully conscious. Yet, by all traditional medical definitions, their bodies have become walking flatlines. By observing these pulseless individuals, science inadvertently stumbled into the ultimate test of the heartbeat paradox. If the conscious mind is truly anchored to the body by the cyclical shock wave of the heart, what happens to the human psyche when that anchor is cut and replaced by a continuous, non-pulsatile flow? The psychological consequences are as profound as they are ghostly. Many individuals who live without a pulse report a strange, pervasive sense of detachment that leaves them feeling like spectators in their own bodies. They describe a subtle fading of emotional intensity, a state where they can understand joy or sadness intellectually, but the raw, visceral color of those emotions feels muted, as if viewed through a sheet of frosted glass. Without the physical compression of the baroreceptors and the resulting heartbeat evoked potential, the brain's internal mirror goes dark. The ego loses its baseline coordinate. Some patients experience profound existential disorientation, looking at their own limbs and wondering who exactly is moving them. This clinical phenomenon reveals that our sense of self is not a permanent monument carved into the structure of the brain. It is an active, fragile illusion that must be continuously recreated, beat by beat, 80,000 times a day. When the pulse vanishes, the brain is forced to adapt to an unprecedented sensory silence. For millions of years, mammalian neurological architecture evolved to operate within a rhythmic environment. The brain adjusted its processing speeds, its visual gating, and its memory consolidation to the rise and fall of blood pressure. When that rhythm is replaced by a flat, unyielding hum, the neural networks begin to drift. The mind, finding no internal reflection of its existence, struggles to maintain its grip on the present moment. Time itself begins to feel elastic and unstructured for those without a pulse. Because our internal perception of time is heavily influenced by our physiological rhythms, the loss of the cardiac metronome alters how the mind segments experience. Moments bleed into one another without distinct boundaries. The continuous flow of the machine creates a continuous, undifferentiated flow of consciousness, stripping the mind of the punctuation marks that naturally organize human memory. This suggests an even darker philosophical implication. If our individuality, our emotional depth, and our structural experience of time are bound to the erratic, organic pulsing of our biology, then the mechanization of the heart represents a quiet rewrite of human nature. We are engineering survival at the expense of the very somatic signals that make us feel real. This tension between the mechanical and the organic forces us to look backward to the ancient origins of our species, to discover why this dependency became so deeply hardwired into our existence. Long before the cortex grew to accommodate philosophy, art, or language, the early nervous systems of primitive organisms were designed for a single solitary purpose: to regulate the internal environment of the body. The brain did not evolve to think. It evolved to keep the internal ocean of the body balanced. Our highest intellectual faculties are merely evolutionary extensions of this basic administrative task. The thoughts you are having right now, the philosophy you contemplate, and the creative impulses you feel are not separate from your biology. They are the intricate, decorative foliage growing from a root system that is anchored entirely in the dark, wet reality of your organs. We have spent centuries clinging to the comforting belief that our consciousness is a divine spark, an ethereal traveler temporarily housed within a physical vessel. We like to imagine that if the vessel breaks, the spark remains untarnished. But the reality under the microscope tells a far more grounding story. The mind is not an independent entity inhabiting the flesh. It is an emergent property of the flesh itself, suspended within the specific, chaotic rhythm of a beating heart. If this rhythm is the invisible architecture that holds the illusion of the self together, then we must confront the practical reality of this bond. How does this silent biological engine shape the choices we make, the stress we carry, and the way we experience our brief existence in the waking world? This intricate biological alliance is not a theoretical concept confined to neurovascular laboratories or intensive care units. It is the invisible scaffolding of your ordinary, waking life. Every day, as you navigate the pressures of your career, the delicate dynamics of your relationships, and the quiet spaces of your own solitude, your heart is actively rewriting your reality from the shadows. The decisions you believe you are making through cold, detached logic are, in truth, the conscious translations of an ongoing cardiovascular monologue. Consider the modern epidemic of chronic stress. We typically view stress as an intellectual problem, a consequence of overfilled calendars, financial pressures, or a demanding digital environment. We attempt to solve it through cognitive interventions, changing our mindsets, practicing mindfulness, or forcing ourselves to think more positively. But our biology operates on a far more primal register. When you sit at a desk, staring at an urgent email, your brain's threat detection circuitry triggers a sympathetic nervous system response, causing your heart to contract with greater force and frequency. This sudden shift in pressure is instantly registered by the baroreceptors in your carotid sinus. If that elevated, rigid rhythm is maintained for hours on end, those receptors send a continuous, frantic stream of electrical signals into your brainstem. The brain reads this physical data as absolute proof that you are under imminent physical attack. In that moment, your intellectual faculties are effectively hijacked by your own pulse. The prefrontal cortex, the seat of long-term planning, emotional regulation, and nuanced empathy, experiences a subtle downregulation. Your perspective narrows, your capacity to process complex nuance diminishes, and you become trapped in a state of cognitive hypervigilance. You cannot simply think your way into a calmer state because the physical pressure wave shaking your brain is shouting that it is unsafe to do so. The body is telling a story of danger, and the mind has no choice but to believe it. This somatic bias explains why our most profound psychological breakthroughs rarely occur when we are actively wrestling with our thoughts. Instead, they happen when the physical rhythm of the body changes. When you step away from the screen, take a walk through a quiet landscape, or engage in deep, rhythmic breathing, you are not just distracting your mind. You are executing a deliberate, bottom-up intervention on your nervous system. By lengthening your exhalations, you stimulate the vagus nerve, which releases a microscopic spray of acetylcholine directly onto the sinoatrial node, the natural pacemaker of your heart. The heart rate slows, the interval between beats expands, and your heart rate variability returns. As the baroreceptors register this sudden drop in tension, they send a new message up to the cortex. The threat has passed. Only then do the higher order networks of the brain unlock. Your perspective widens. A creative solution to a seemingly impossible problem suddenly appears, and your emotional equilibrium returns. The intellect did not solve the crisis. The heart simply gave the mind permission to think clearly again. This realization forces us to re-evaluate how we cultivate resilience in an increasingly fragmented world. We have spent decades prioritizing the training of the mind, treating the body as little more than a passive vehicle designed to carry our intelligence from one meeting to the next. We study cognitive behavioral techniques, track our productivity metrics, and attempt to optimize our psychological frameworks. Yet, we remain profoundly vulnerable to the unspoken tides of our physiology. True psychological sovereignty requires a shift in focus from the thought to the rhythm that sustains it. It demands that we listen to the interior architecture of our selfhood, recognizing that our moods, our cognitive blind spots, and our daily anxieties are often just the echoes of an unexamined cardiac pattern. We cannot control every thought, that drifts through the vast space of our consciousness, but we can influence the biological baseline that determines whether those thoughts are written in the language of panic or the language of peace. If our daily existence is so thoroughly tethered to this somatic cycle, then our understanding of what it means to be an individual must undergo a radical transformation. We are not ghosts in a machine pulling levers from a safe intellectual distance. We are an integrated, living symphony where the melody of our thoughts is entirely dependent on the steady, rhythmic bass line pulsing beneath our ribs. But as we stand on the threshold of this realization, we are left to confront the final, most intimate boundary of the heartbeat paradox. If our consciousness is bound beat by beat to this physical anchor, what happens when the rhythm inevitably begins to slow? What occurs in those final, quiet moments when the metronome that has dictated our entire experience of reality prepares to strike its very last note? We spend our entire lives running away from the reality of our own fragility, constructing elaborate intellectual monuments to convince ourselves that we are permanent. We write books, build societies, and lose ourselves in the infinite loops of our thoughts, all to maintain the illusion that our consciousness is an independent force, floating safely above the messy, decaying reality of the flesh. We treat the mind as the immortal author of our existence, and the body as a disposable parchment. Yet, this entire magnificent structure remains completely dependent on a single, fragile biological agreement. Every thought you have ever had, every memory you hold dear, and every dream you have chased has been bought and paid for by the rhythmic compression of a single muscle. Your sense of time, your emotional landscape, and your very conviction that you exist as an individual are not self-sustaining truths. They are luxury goods, generated millisecond by millisecond by the pulsing architecture of your cardiovascular system. We do not possess a body. We are a continuous somatic performance, conducted by an engine that never takes a day off. And eventually, that engine must slow down. In the final moments of human life, as the cardiac metronome prepares to strike its last note, the relationship between the brain and the heart undergoes one last, dramatic transformation. As the heartbeat falters, the heartbeat-evoked potential, the electrical signal that has anchored the ego to the flesh for decades, begins to fracture. The brain, suddenly deprived of its rhythmic compass, can no longer locate itself in space. The boundaries of the self, which once felt so solid and unyielding, begin to soften. This is the moment where the illusion of isolation dissolves. Patients who have hovered on the edge of cardiac arrest frequently describe a profound sense of peace, a feeling of stepping out of a cramped, localized identity and expanding into an ocean of undifferentiated awareness. They do not report a terrifying plunge into nothingness. They describe it as a homecoming, without the heavy, restrictive cadence of the pulse, keeping the mind bound to a specific point behind the eyes. Consciousness is finally allowed to lose its definition. The kite string snaps, and the mind drifts back into the vast, silent field from which it originally emerged. This reveals the ultimate resolution of the heartbeat paradox. The rhythm that anchors your consciousness to your body is not a cage designed to trap you. It is a temporary clearing in the woods, a localized focus that allows the universe to experience itself from a specific, beautifully fragile point of view. The pulse is the only thing keeping you from spilling out into everything else. We tend to look at the stillness of a stopped heart with fear, seeing it as the absolute destruction of who we are. But if the science of our interior architecture has taught us anything, it is that the rhythm and the silence are two parts of the same continuous movement. The beat gives us our individuality, our passion, and our distinct human perspective. But the quiet between the beats is where we belong. We are not independent minds pulling the levers of a biological machine. We are the song that the heart sings into the dark vault of the skull, and when the music finally stops, the singer does not disappear. It simply returns to the silence,